Okay, this next question asks, a scientist is trying to determine the evolutionary relationships among species of very similar physical characteristics. So maybe two birds that seem very identical in size, shape, maybe there's just a color difference in the feathers or what have you. One method to determine the relationships is by comparing amino acid sequences of proteins, right? So let's remember that when we're talking about amino acids, proteins are a chain of amino acids all connected together through peptide bonds. And which amino acids go in the first position or second position or third position or what have you will determine how this protein functions. There's a difference between one protein and another. Let's further remember that it all started with the DNA molecule, and that first an mRNA was transcribed. So you went from DNA to RNA. Then that RNA was translated, so this was transcription. And then that mRNA was translated into a protein by the use of this thing called the ribosome. It's an enzyme called the ribosome that's also made of RNA, interestingly, but a special kind of RNA called rRNA. All right. So this gene that made this protein that was transcribed and then translated, if you had two species, two different birds, they would have two different sets of DNA. And that would mean that they'd have some differences in their genes, and therefore they would have some differences in somewhere along here. They'd have some differences in their there'd be some differences in their amino acid sequences, because if you have a different gene, you're a different species, you have a different gene, you're going to have a different set of amino acids. Maybe they're shorter, or maybe they're just different in which amino acids are found in which position, what have you. The point is that the differences between the two amino acids are going to be defined by their genes. So if the two species of bird or whatever are different, then they'll have many differences in their proteins and their amino acid sequences. And if they're the same species, then they're going to be pretty much the same. They might have different alleles, so they might be slightly different. So scientists can compare amino acid sequences of proteins common to those similar proteins common to those similar species. So they'd be proteins that they both share. They both have the same proteins, but how similar are the proteins? If they're extremely different, if the variation is so large, then perhaps we can call these two a different species, or how we can see how close they are, rather. So the closer they are to each other, the more similar their amino acid sequence is. What does that have to do with evolution? Well, the more similar their amino acid sequences, the more similar their DNA, which they inherited from their parents. So that would suggest that they have a relative. If they're very similar, they have a relative much closer in the evolutionary history than two that are not as similar. All right. So why would a scientist compare amino acid sequences of proteins common to those similar species? Amino acid sequence differences provide evidence of gene flow among species. Well, that's not true. We don't know if those were mutations. We don't know. That doesn't make any sense, right? It could, but gene flow generally happens between the same species, not between species. Amino acid differences, and the differences wouldn't be due to gene flow. It would be due to not having gene flow, right? Being isolated, and those mutations then building up in that population. Amino acid differences reflect in the accumulated differences in the DNA of the species. Well, isn't that what we just talked about, right? It said that these these chains of amino acids are going to be different, more or less different, depending on how different their DNA is. And as these two species are isolated, and let's talk about that for a second, because I think it's valuable to go ahead and talk about that. And you've seen this in different videos, and different Nearpods, and different in your textbook. But you have these individuals, and they're in a population. And something happens, and the population splits. Who knows? Some of them were over here, and there was an earthquake, and then that led to a river forming between the two that doesn't let them mate anymore, right? So they can't see each other anymore. They're not birds. They're turtles. They'll drown if they try to cross the river. So these turtles now live on two sides of the river. Fast forward 1,000 years, 10,000 years, and there's going to be mutations that happen. This mutation, and these guys over here have this mutation, and perhaps they have some other mutations. They're going to have mutations. We know mutations happen. They're going to have babies with one another, and the mutations that are successful are going to show up in the population. So these are going to be different, but these other populations are also going to have mutations in those proteins. Now they share proteins; they were related thousands of years ago. So they share some of the alleles, but some of the alleles are going to be very different, right? Some of the alleles are going to have mutations that you wouldn't expect. Which is going to make the species just, that is what a species is, an accumulation of differences between them that have happened through mutation. This group over here mutated different random changes in the amino acid sequence. They've been separated for a very long time, so those random differences have accumulated. So perhaps they have a longer neck. These guys have longer necks, or they have a different shaped beak, or their shell is a different color now, or what have you. But the difference between them and these amino acid sequences are happening because they're not able to share the DNA. They're not able to have gene flow. They can't have gene flow. So that's where differences happen. That's why A was wrong. Amino acid sequences differences reflect the accumulated differences of DNA of a species over time. Accumulated suggests over time, and that's correct. So that's the correct answer. But I'm going to read all of them because I don't know. Maybe there's a better answer. So let's go ahead and read the rest. Amino acid sequence differences are the only useful data for constructing accurate cladograms of a species. Well, we know that's not true. We can use gene sequences. We can use structures. We can use the fossil records. We could use behavior. We can choose their diet. So there's all kinds of data that we can compare and look at similarities and differences and that suggest to us how closely related they are evolutionarily. Things they inherited from an ancestor. Amino acid sequences differences are the result of mutations caused by different speciation pressures, different selection pressures experienced by the species. Amino acid the mutations themselves, so let's be clear on that. That's a trick. I don't like it when they throw these words together and try to trick people. I think it's not useful. So they're throwing part of this sounds right, and they did that on purpose. It sounds like it's right, but it's not. And let's talk about why this one's wrong and why does it sound like it's right? Why is it confusing? You might ask yourself, well, sometimes these things are so confusing. You're right. And unfortunately, the writers choose to make it confusing for some reason. Obviously, they're trying to test if you understand the idea, but you don't have to. They don't have to make an answer that's just close to right. Obviously, B, as I said, I already made my choice, but let's discuss why D is wrong. Amino acid sequences differences are the result of mutation. See that part right there? That part of the answer is correct. And they're predicting that you would read that and perhaps you would choose it, right? Because you'd know that the difference, you'd know the link. The reason you would choose that is you would know the link between amino acids and the mutations that happen in DNA. But then you look at caused by different selection pressures. See, that's not correct. This is what makes this part makes this answer wrong. And it sounds so right. It sounds so right that some people would want to choose it. But let's talk about why it's wrong. So you have a DNA sequence, some kind of DNA sequence. Let's not even bother putting letters to them. Let's call them yellow. This gene, this DNA sequence, this gene is yellow. And there it sits. And some mutation happens. And so you have this yellow, let's go ahead and draw the population over here. You have this yellow population, that these individuals with the yellow gene, the gene sequence, and a mutation happens. And they continue to have babies. That mutation turns that gene from one form, one sequence to another sequence. So they're going to be red. But they're also having babies, and so you have red and yellows in there. The gene spreads in the population. So that's mutation. Mutation increases genetic variability. It increases the differences among individuals in a population, right? But then something happens. Some form of death occurs. It comes along and wipes out. Take your pick. It takes out the yellows. The yellows no longer are the most favorable. It selectively kills the yellow ones. For whatever reason, the yellow ones are wiped out. Dead. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm picking red ones. It's a virus or bacteria or predator chooses whatever the situation is. The yellows are selected against. They are more likely to die, and over time, this population then becomes mostly the ones that survive have babies. They continue on. They mourn their fellows, and they continue to move forward and have babies. And what's left in the population is this red mutated gene. So having the mutation does not it's not caused by selection. The mutation is caused by what? What could cause a mutation? Radiation, a chemical, the natural mistakes that happen during DNA replication. Whatever the cause, mutations happen. And then the next question is what natural selection then chooses which of the different beings in a population is best fit to survive. And over time, the populations are different. Well, why are they different? Because different mutations happened here than here because they're genetically isolated. Because they're isolated, they can't have babies with one another. There's different mutations over here. Are they different enough to be considered a different species? Well, you'd have to do that analysis. At some point, you're going to call them a different species. How different is it? When is it that you to choose to call them a different species? It's a choice. We can use the simplistic definition of a species and say, if the two don't, species are groups of individuals that have babies that can have babies, right? Or productive members that are reproductively successful. Then we can call them a species. That's fine. But that's not the only definition of a species. So be careful. The bottom line is this question is wrong in a very subtle way. And it's not so subtle, but yet it's subtle because of the differences, the ways they phrased it. And the fact is that these individuals that genetic mutations happen, they increase genetic variation, they make the population, individuals in the population different, and selection pressure is what selects against one form of the individuals and not others in a population. So the ones with the yellow in this example were chosen against, and the red ones are the ones that survived. So the two are linked. What genetic variation mutations do is increases genetic variation. In fact, by definition, it evolves the population. But then the natural selection then chooses one variation of that protein over the other. The one protein gives the one group an advantage over the other. So something to consider, very subtle but important difference, and could lead to confusion on this test. And that's the last one on this set. I will do the rest of the sets in just a minute and upload those.